Hello, everyone. I have just read this book, Bullshit Jobs: The Rise of Pointless Work and What We Can Do About It by David Graeber, or it might be Graeber. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Who is unfortunately dead now. He was an anthropologist at Yale, at UCL. Absolutely brilliant book. I'll read you some of what's written on the back. Hilarious, thought-provoking by Emma Duncan at the Times. A provocative, funny, and engaging book that claims the world has been engulfed by a rising tide of pointless work, taps into one of the big anxieties of our time, by Pelita Clark, Financial Times. There's a few other ones on there as well. Spectacular and Terrifyingly True by Owen Jones. How many people do you think their job is bullshit? Loads. I reckon that's one of the reasons I picked it up. I wonder if any of my bosses are watching this. So, anyway, David Graeber was invited in 2013 to write an article for a new magazine that was being launched called Strike. So he did, and it was called, I think it was called Bullshit Jobs, or the phenomenon of bullshit jobs, or something like that. And then once he'd written it, he went away to Quebec to do nothing but read for a couple of weeks, and so he was not on the web, on the internet. He had no way of tracking things. Whilst he was away, millions of people read the article. It was shared by millions of people. It became a bit of a, it went viral. And on the 5th of January, which in the UK is when everyone goes back to work after the winter break, the Christmas break, people had taken lines from his article and posted them on the underground, on people's cars. So obviously it hit a nerve. So he decided to turn it into a book, and he did a whole lot of research, which shows that in the UK, about 50% of people think their job is bullshit. And that means it serves no purpose, there's no point to it, they're essentially getting paid to do something that has completely no benefit whatsoever. And then he even goes into categories of different types of bullshit jobs. You've got duct tapers, people whose only job is to fix something that's been messed up by somebody else, which is a pointless job if the other person just did their job properly. You've got there's a few of them. You've got taskmasters, whose only job is to find things for other people who've got nothing to do. There's a brilliant joke in here actually, which is a boss says to somebody, "Why are you sitting there doing nothing?" And then the employee says, "Well, I've done everything. There's nothing to do." And then the boss says, "Well, you're being paid, so you should at least pretend you're working." And then the employee says, "Yeah, but you're being paid too, a lot more than me, so why don't you just pretend I'm working?" Funny, but it sums up a lot of stuff. And it's serious too. This book introduced me to a lot of theories, a lot of concepts I had no idea about, and put them together in new ways. That's creativity, isn't it? Put them together in new ways which make things make sense, or make me see things in a different way. And any book which can do that, or any conversation which can do that, I think is a very good conversation, because it changes your thoughts, it expands your thinking, it makes you see things from a different perspective. It's also very, very funny. The guy's a great writer. Somebody else picked this book up and said, "I just read a bit of it," and he's a very good writer, isn't he? He is unfortunately dead. So if we go through the actual chapters and the sections, it'll give you a bit more of an idea of what the book covers. Chapter 1, what is a bullshit job? Why a mafia hitman is not a good example of a bullshit job. On the importance of the subjective element, and also why it can be assumed that those who believe they have bullshit jobs are generally correct. On the common misconception that bullshit jobs are confined largely to the public sector. Why hairdressers are a poor example of a bullshit job. On the difference between partly bullshit jobs, mostly bullshit jobs, and purely and entirely bullshit jobs. These are actually the sections in the book, and as funny as they sound, they're all quite serious. When you actually read them, you think, damn, he's got a point. Or it certainly makes you think. Chapter 2, what sorts of bullshit jobs are there? The 5 major varieties of bullshit jobs. What flunkies do. So flunkies are people whose only job is to make somebody else feel important. People who open doors for important people, etc. And they actually proliferate a lot in places like universities, where every professor has to have a secretary, and they have to have, deputy deans or whatever, and all this nonsense. What goons do. What duct tapers do, what box tickers do, what taskmasters do, on complex multi-form bullshit jobs. So some bullshit jobs can be a combination of these categories we've passed so far. So box tickers are people like, there's somebody who wrote in here and said their entire job was to scan loyalty card forms to make sure there are no mistakes. All right. A word on second order bullshit jobs, which are bullshit jobs created to support primary order bullshit jobs. A final note with a brief return to question, is it possible to have a bullshit job and not know it? One of the points he raises in here is that in the 1930s, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, said that we will have something called technological unemployment, which is where as jobs become more and more automated, as they had done in factories and now AI does a lot of jobs, the unemployment rate will rise massively to about 50%. Graeber argues in here quite convincingly that actually it has, but so that politicians can say, that unemployment hovers between 3 and 8%, which is acceptable. Many bullshit jobs have been created. And actually, he does the sums where if you look at all the people in employment and you say 50% of them are in bullshit jobs, then the real unemployment rate is about 50%. So the great technological unemployment predicted by Keynes has actually happened. So that's a very interesting point. This is a good way to jog my memory about the book. Chapter 3. Why do those bullshit jobs, I can read really. Why do those in bullshit jobs regularly report themselves unhappy? On spiritual violence, part 1. About one young man apparently handed a sinecure who nonetheless found himself unable to handle the situation. Concerning the experience of falseness and the purposelessness at the core of bullshit jobs and the importance now felt of conveying the experience of falselessness and purposelessness to youth, while many of our fundamental assumptions on human motivation appear to be incorrect. A brief excursus on the history of make work and particularly of the concept of buying other people's time, concerning the clash between the morality of time and the natural work rhythms and the resentment it creates. So there's something called the morality of envy, which is where there's never been a book written on this according to David Graeber, but of course it may have been since he passed away or since he wrote this book. So the morality of envy is this thing where, because so many people are in bullshit jobs, they envy other people who do jobs which actually have a point or do some good. And so there's this phenomenon where people who do things which are harmful, not banking, let's just say finance. So finance is essentially just created to get more and more people in lifelong debt. It doesn't actually do any good whatsoever, apart from maybe insurance, which, can help people, does help people when something goes terribly wrong. It's moving a risk that individuals and families can't afford to companies that can afford them, insurance companies. But other than that, it's basically just a giant system of making sure everybody stays in debt and the people who are running finance make more and more money. So, how did I get onto that? Oh my God. So they are a job that really does no good whatsoever. So are arms dealers, so is the tobacco industry, so is advertising, etc. But they get paid a lot more than most people. Corporate lawyers get paid a lot more than other lawyers. And so the envy there is, well, teachers, doctors, nurses, the people who do jobs that actually improve the world for everybody don't deserve money because they get the satisfaction of doing a job that actually matters. So the idea or the observation that if you actually do any good, you get paid hardly even a living wage. And if you do something which is inherently bad or evil, you make loads of money. That is considered in this overall context as the way it should be, which is just crazy, right? But I'd never encountered that before. So because of that alone, this book is very, very good. And then there's the idea of buying time, which in some societies doesn't exist. We have our time, our labor time, which we give to the people, the bourgeois, so the capitalists, if you want to call them. Then everybody else is the workers or the proletariat, right? They only have their time to give. When people like Keynes were putting forward the idea of technological unemployment, there was also this dream in the 50s and the 60s that, we would be a society where everybody had so much time to pursue things they wanted to pursue because productivity would have increased to such a degree that they could. And we could, according to this book, all be working about 20 hours a week and be just as productive. The economy would be just as strong. But why is that not allowed to happen? Because there's this old fear that, the very wealthy or those in charge or politicians have, that if people have time on their hands, then they'll all do crazy stuff like just drink and, and why should people not work? If you don't work, you're a bad person. And if you do work, and if your work is bullshit and does harm, then you're a good person. there's a bit of a moral contradiction there. It arises in Calvinism in the idea that, this is all from this book, yeah, the idea that God was the creator, so man must also create. And then in America, before, in America, what happened is that the producers during the Civil War, the people who actually make stuff, were seen as the most important people, not the people who own everything, right? But nowhere in the world has the pushback against that idea been so great, so consistent, and so violent as it was in America. So now in America, which is why America is the most capitalist country in the world, yeah, it also has the lowest social mobility of any developed country, by the way. So all this bullshit about the American dream, if you still buy it, you're dreaming. Statistically speaking, let's get back to this book. As you can tell, it's absolutely fascinating. And what else was there on here? Oh yeah, so one of the guys who wrote into this, when he wrote the first article back in 2013, it led to a lot of people sending in their experiences of what they call bullshit jobs. It led to the definition of different types of bullshit jobs. So it was a project in the making for a long time with loads and loads of data. And one of the guys said, he was in advertising or something like that, and his job was, you take a freshly shot TV show or something, or movie, and you touch up, visually, all the actors and the actresses to make their skin look even more perfect, to make their teeth look even whiter, to make their hair look even more, flawless, their eyes brighter, make them look slimmer or more muscular or whatever, or more curvy. What that does is that creates amongst the viewers the idea that they're all inadequate, they're not that perfect. And then the other part of the job was to edit commercials to sell the solution to the psychological inadequacies created by the big lie that is the touched up movies. And he said this job pays well, but it's just absolute bullshit. Making people believe they need things they don't need by creating an illusion, and then making people believe that the products that we're advertising will cure those, once again by creating an illusion. Fascinating book, actually. So, what is it like to have a bullshit job? This is chapter 4, by the way. Why having a bullshit job is not always necessarily bad. Yeah, you could have a job where you basically don't do much and you get paid for it, or the job is super easy and it serves no purpose, but it does no harm either. Going back to the religious idea that people who don't work are bad, and the government's job is to have everybody in employment. Well, the communists did, by the way, have everybody in employment, which is why things were so inefficient. Yeah? If people aren't working, it doesn't mean they're evil. The world isn't going to fall apart. The whole point of work being that everybody can afford a comfortable, safe living. But what if you could do that and not be beholden to a company or a boss? One of the other things he does is he also likens working for a lot of people to a sadomasochistic relationship. But in those relationships, there's a safe word, right? So if the torture or the tickling or the whatever it is, the insertions or whatever get too much, you have a safe word, which he says would be orange, right? But that's what work is. It's just somebody exercising their power over somebody else in a lot of ways with no other useful benefit, right? It's a game which you're trapped in because you need money to live. And so there's no safe word apart from I quit, but a lot of people can't afford to quit. So then later on in here, he raises the idea of universal basic income. I didn't know how I felt about this, but I'm starting to get more into the idea, because when it was introduced in India, rates of domestic violence fell massively because the women who traditionally in India didn't have the money, if the man starts beating them or treating them like crap, can say, well, look, I've got money, I don't need you now, I can leave, I'm safe, right? Disabled people were more, because India has a very strong class system. Basically, if you're of the wrong class, if I was of a higher class, I could come and shit in your mouth and nobody would do anything, right? Because it's a very strong caste system, right? The law's not going to protect you or anything. So when they introduced the universal basic income in India as an experiment, those class divisions and that class abuse disappeared. Women started actually taking part in society rather than being the coy, modest that they're meant to be, to please the man, the breadwinner. Also, one of the examples he gives that made me a bit more open to the idea of universal basic income. First of all, I had to be convinced of the idea that if you don't work, you're not evil. That you're not evil if you don't work. Work wasn't always a necessity. There are plenty of societies where people just do what's required to keep things going, and they're coming more and more rare. And then the rest of the time, they fill their time with, things like spending time with their family or doing art or doing other things. How terrible is that? I don't know, right? Sounds pretty good to me, right? So once I'd had that idea, then, you know, you're getting a universal basic income, you're not working, you must be evil. Universal basic income would have to be universal, of course. It doesn't mean that just because you're already rich, you don't get it. Otherwise, it's no longer fair. But where does the money come from? So now people who genuinely need benefits, as capitalism advances, lots of people with a full-time job, you still can't afford to eat, right? Because more and more power is in the hand of capital, the bourgeois, the people who own everything, and workers are just expendable, essentially, right? And the money required, for example, to oversee the allocation of benefits and to make it as hard as possible to access those benefits, and the offices that it takes to house all the people whose job it is to do that, would cost more than it would just to give, say, 20 grand to every person. And you could do away with the offices as well. If you did away with all those offices and all the air conditioning, you'd have a fantastic reduction in the rate at which climate change is happening. So, very good book. Obviously, I like doing my review like this. If you think it sucks and you'd rather just ramble on, isn't that a Led Zeppelin song? Ramble, yeah. Put a comment in the comment section. Go ahead. All right. So back to why are bullshit jobs proliferating? A brief excursus on causality and the nature of sociological explanation. Sundry notes on the role of government in creating and maintaining bullshit jobs. What I was just talking about. Apparently, even though the majority of the US thinks that the private insurance-based healthcare system in the US is absolute madness, makes no sense, and is just a piss take. Obama said that, but Obama said if you had free healthcare, then what about all the jobs of the people involved in processing the insurance claims? So rather than actually having a system that works, the government there is proliferating bullshit jobs because it's so important for people to have jobs. But those jobs are a waste of money, and they make everybody unhealthier. You've got a higher chance of death during childbirth in a lot of American states than you have in East Africa. Yeah, most advanced country in the world. All right, so sundry notes on the role of government in creating and maintaining bullshit jobs, concerning some false explanations for the rise of bullshit jobs, why the financial industry might be considered a paradigm for bullshit job creation, on some ways in which the current form of managerial feudalism resembles classical feudalism, and other ways in which it does not. So in feudalism, you basically had the person with the power who had lots of people underneath him who had a bit of power and a bit more power, and then underneath them a bit less power. This is often the case. You get middle management, who have their flunkies and then their flunkies, and they have to find something for them to do. You do away with all those people, nothing would happen. I think it was in was it Denmark? It was maybe one of the Scandinavian countries where large parts of the government posts, such as Minister for Education and everything, weren't filled. In some cases, for more than a year, nothing happened to the quality of education at all. It just meant that some high-paid guy or some high-paid lady making decisions that didn't really affect anybody and maintain a whole lot of bullshit jobs wasn't getting taxpayer money. That's what happened. So, on some ways in which the current so we've had that one. How managerial feudalism manifests itself in the creative industries through an endless multiplication of intermediary executive ranks. Talks about Hollywood there, how it used to be a place where there was one man or one woman, usually a man, in charge of a studio who took risks, who put their own money in films, and that's how the movie industry came about. And now it's just, hundreds of people it has to go through who go out and have high-powered lunches and do nothing, and occasionally a film gets made or a program gets made, and the rest of the time it's just people being paid to do absolutely nothing. Yeah, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of time. Conclusion, with a brief return to the question of three levels of causation. All right, Chapter 6, why do we as a society not object to the growth of pointless employment? On the impossibility of developing an absolute measure of value, that is very interesting. How most people in contemporary society do accept the notion of a social value that can be distinguished from economic value, even if it is very difficult to pin down what it is. These are the subheadings, by the way, right? So, one thing you get from this book is this guy was obviously incredibly intelligent with a lot of knowledge from different fields, and the way he weaves them together in a way that makes sense, his perspicuity, so to speak, is incredible. This is like a whole university course that feels just like reading a whole bunch of interesting short stories. It's definitely one worth reading again, a few times maybe. Concerning the inverse relationship between the social value of work and the amount of money one is likely to be paid for it, we've already covered that. On the theological roots of our attitudes towards labour, Adam Smith was a theological. Basically, economics has risen out of moral philosophy, which rose out of theology. So the whole idea that, if idle hands, devil's workshop, all that nonsense. Okay. On the origins of the Northern European notion of paid labour as necessary to the full formation of an adult human being. So in England, children from the age of about 9 were shipped off to someone else's house. It didn't matter if you're rich or poor, as servants. Being a servant was considered an apprenticeship to being a fully formed adult. And here's the important thing: they were actually paid for it. So it wasn't slave labour. Okay. How, with the advent of capitalism, work came to be seen in many quarters either as a means of social reform or ultimately as a virtue in its own right, and how labourers countered by embracing the labour theory of value. Labour theory of value is very interesting. I've been already going on for a long time, but that's certainly something worth reading up on. Concerning the key flaw in the labour theory of value, as it became popular in the 19th century, and how the owners of capital exploited that flaw. How, over the course of the 20th century, work came to be increasingly valued primarily as a form of discipline and self-sacrifice. I'm a good person because I work hard. That's where that comes from. Finally, what are the political effects of bullshit jobs, and is there anything that can be done about the situation? On how the political culture under managerial feudalism came to be maintained by a balance of resentments. How are you thinking, what the hell does this mean? I am, even though I've read the book. I have to read the book again. How the current crisis over robotization relates to the larger problem of bullshit jobs, on the political ramifications of bullshitization and the consequent decline of productivity in the caring sector as it relates to the possibility of revolt of the caring classes. Robots can't replace caring jobs. And even when the Mayor of London tried to shut down all the ticket offices, he wasn't just shutting down. Nobody seemed to realise that what these people who work in the ticket offices do is they help disabled people, they talk down drunks, they talk down suicidal people, all stuff that can't be replaced by a machine. Okay, they help people who are lost to find their way. So many other things. That's all caring jobs. On universal basic income, as an example of a program that might begin to detach work from compensation and put an end to the dilemmas described in this book. I don't usually do my book reviews like that, but this is an excellent book. I hope doing my book review like that wasn't too boring, but I recommend everybody reads it. Explosive, a call to strike out for freedom from meaningless work. John McDonnell, New Statesman, Books of the Year. Imagine if everybody had a bit of money and you didn't have to go and subject yourself to a job you hated just because if you didn't do that, you wouldn't be able to eat. Would that not make the world a better place? Is it something that needs more thinking about? I think it is. But anyway, I have no idea how long this review is. I hope you enjoyed it. This is getting a 10 out of 10. I will read it again. I suggest you read it again. I suggest you read it if you haven't read it. David Graeber. He's also written another book called The Dawn of Everything with a historian called David Wengrow, I believe. David Wengrow is still alive. So once I've read that, I'll review that as well. Hope you enjoyed that.